Summer 1944, Western Ukraine. Worn thin by days of insomnia, Ivan Gromov, commander of a heavy self-propelled gun, gripped the handles of the panoramic sight with fingers blanched white from tension. The optics caught a black cross distorted by the heat haze on the frontal armor of the enemy's lead vehicle. The sudden, heavy metallic clatter of German tracks ruthlessly tore through the thick forest silence. Time froze instantly, compressing into one long breath that scorched parched lungs. The crew had only seconds for a fatal, crushing first strike against the moving column of 230 enemy soldiers. Nervous tension hammered at his temples like a phantom sledgehammer. His hands trembled slightly from the extreme concentration. Acrid, salty sweat blurred the narrow glass of the periscopes, stinging his inflamed eyes. The human body was operating at its absolute limit, on the very edge of total failure. The slightest mistake by the driver on the tillers or a gunner's finger twitching would immediately compromise their firing position. 46 tons of Soviet weapon-grade steel would transform in an instant from a lurking predator into a common, blazing mass grave for 5 living men. The engine was cut. A ringing silence filled their ears, pressing against their eardrums far harder than the weight of the atmosphere. The deadly trap was calculated with icy mathematical and engineering precision. The multi-ton machine was dug deep into the dry earth up to its fenders and completely concealed by wide camouflage nets thick with freshly woven oak branches. The enemy moved carelessly through the hollow. The direct line of fire was strictly limited to a narrow corridor between the thick trunks of ancient trees. "Range exactly 400, the gunner's dry, cracked whisper barely scratched the stifling silence of the fighting compartment. "Keep the lead on the AP, Gromov rasped, never taking his eyes off the rubber eyepiece for a second. Do not fire without my direct order. They're keeping the column tight. Side skirts are open. Wait! Endure and wait!" The horizontal traverse, severely limited by the design, left the crew no chance to correct a mistake. If the column stopped before the calculated point or suddenly accelerated, the multi-ton barrel simply wouldn't have the physical time to swing around. Gromov felt the colossal weight of the machine in every cell of his body. An armor-piercing shell weighing nearly 100 pounds had already clanged home into the steel breech. The 152mm caliber of the tank howitzer gun guaranteed a through-and-through penetration of any enemy armor at this range. But it was the first shot that had to be paralyzing. The heavy click of the safety being disengaged sounded in the sweltering space like a final sentence for the advancing enemy. For the crew itself, that dry metallic sound marked the point of no return. The air inside the cramped compartment literally vibrated with extreme internal tension. A sudden glitch broke the perfect geometry of the ambush. A heavy motorcycle with a machine gun unexpectedly darted out from behind the wide frontal armor of the lead German tank. The motorcyclists braked hard and began slowly scanning the tree line through their optics. The distance closed rapidly. 300 meters. 250. "Commander, they're spotting us," the driver exhaled convulsively, his fingers gripping the tillers until his knuckles turned white. "Hold your position," Gromov cut him off. The keen gaze of a German officer through binoculars slid millimeter by millimeter along the oak undergrowth, moving directly toward the camouflaged hide. That minute lasted a year. Gromov could clearly see the dull glint of the enemy's binocular lenses. One movement inside the compartment, one accidental sun glint on the periscopes, and heavy slugs would immediately slam into their position. The loader froze like a statue, a fresh shell in his lowered hands. The thick metal of the hull had heated up under the sun so much that it noticeably scorched skin through the fabric of their tunics. The motorcycle screeched to a halt at the roadside, The officer lowered his binoculars and authoritatively raised his right hand. The multi-ton column began to clatter to a halt. The perfectly timed plan for a sudden ambush in motion was collapsing right now. Gromov ground his teeth until his jaws ached. He instantly plotted a new fire trajectory. If he struck now, the enemy infantry would quickly scatter and tightly encircle the immobilized machine. If he waited, the scouts would guaranteed uncover the camouflage. "Belay that talk. Target his armor." The commander's voice sounded like the clack of a closing bolt. He shifted the crosshairs to the left, aiming with extreme precision at the vulnerable turret ring of the lead tank. The angle of impact for the heavy AP shell against the sloped armor had to be perfect. No accidental ricochets allowed. Only a through-and-through penetration with a guaranteed detonation of the entire ammo rack would do. War is dirty physical labor that tolerates no emotion. Inside the stifling compartment, there was room only for engineering calculation and soulless mechanical execution of the task. Gromov's finger froze a single millimeter from the cold metal of the trigger. The enemy officer in the sidecar of the halted motorcycle pulled out a lighter and casually lit up. A thin trail of blue smoke rose vertically. The hot wind shifted unpredictably. A treacherous gust blew the cloud of smoke toward the ambush, slightly rustling the dusty camouflage net on the long barrel of the heavy gun. The old net slipped down a few fatal centimeters, completely exposing the dull metal of the massive muzzle brake. Gromov instantly stopped breathing. He saw clearly through the optics as the officer's entire body suddenly tensed. The half-smoked cigarette immediately fell from his weakened fingers. The enemy jerked his head, staring intently at the unnatural shadow beneath the ancient oaks. His mouth opened wide for a loud, warning shout. The range was exactly 150 meters. The point of no return had been passed for good. The deadly paralysis of waiting was instantly replaced by the animal instinct for survival. Human nerves finally snapped under the colossal pressure. The commander's finger crunched as he slammed the cold trigger home to the stop. The recoil of memory struck hard. Pre-war Kharkiv dissolved in the acrid smoke of recollection. Ivan Gromov, lead design engineer at an armored plant, slammed his blueprints onto the table. The lines of a new medium tank's hull remained forever unfinished. Total war began. The creator shed his work jacket, gave his wife a hard promise to return alive, and silently stepped into a freezing cattle car. The gifted mathematician instantly became a mere cog in the machine of destruction. The first battles ruthlessly ground any human illusions into bloody dust. In the autumn of '41, his T-34 took a German AP shell directly in the engine compartment. The thick armor was shattered. Diesel fumes ignited. Gromov kicked open the jammed turret hatch with his boots and tumbled onto the frozen earth like a blazing torch. The driver and radio operator remained to burn alive in the red-hot steel box. Gromov smothered the flames on his coveralls, pressing his burned face into the autumn mud. He lay motionless, listening to the wild, metallic howl of his own machine's ammunition exploding. That sound forever burned away his ability to feel the pain of loss. In place of human emotions came cold, manic, technical calculation. Ugly scars tightened his burned face. Command quickly noticed the surviving tanker's abnormal pedantry. Gromov no longer heard the roar of explosions. He manically listened to the frequency of enemy engines. By the sound of clattering tracks, he could unerringly determine the wear on the transmission gears of a German tank from hundreds of meters away. This animal-like technical hearing made him the ideal candidate for commanding a fundamentally different type of combat vehicle. He was entrusted with 46 tons of Ural armor steel, a heavy, self-propelled artillery mount, a deaf, clumsy, armored box without a rotating turret, armed with a monstrous howitzer barrel. The machine is heavy, sluggish, and completely blind, the battalion commander remarked while handing over the vehicle. She's not blind. She just requires precise calculation, Gromov cut him off dryly, accepting the logbook. The engineer understood the physics of this mass down to the last detail. High ground pressure inevitably caused the heavy SPG to bog down deep in the sodden earth. The center of gravity was shifted forward because of the gun. The slightest miscalculation by the driver during a sharp turn would immediately throw a track off the idler. Gromov forced his new crew to practice their coordination for weeks until they were exhausted. He struck his subordinates' hands for any unnecessary movement. The human mechanism inside the steel hull had to operate without any play. Nothing remained of the creator. The engineer had transformed into a ruthless butcher, using the laws of physics to annihilate the enemy. Return to the stifling reality of the current ambush. Preparing this firing position had taken 7 hours of continuous, back-breaking labor in the night forest. Gromov himself, crawling on his knees, had measured every sector of fire, methodically driving stakes into the dry ground. The gun's horizontal traverse was only 10 degrees. The barrel barely moved left or right. If the enemy moved outside this narrow sector, the SPG would turn into a massive, helpless target. The former designer had exquisitely turned this critical flaw into a death sentence for the enemy. He had driven the machine into the narrowest bottleneck of a forest ravine. "The sector is too narrow. If they stop off to the side, we won't reach them," the gunner rasped nervously, wiping his sweat-soaked forehead. "They won't stop. The ground in the hollow is soft. They'll stay tight in a single track," the commander cut him off monotonically. He had unerringly calculated the weight of the advancing enemy armor. The German machines physically wouldn't risk moving off the hard dirt road onto the marshy shoulder. They would line themselves up into a perfect line of fire. Gromov mathematically calculated the arc of the 90-pound shell's flight. He accounted for derivation, the wear of the barrel's rifling, and the temperature of the powder charge. Range, crosswind speed, air humidity, dozens of parameters converged into a single pulsing point on the crosshairs of the panoramic sight. The machine had become a surgical instrument. A sudden, dull screech broke the perfect calculation. The engine of the lead German tank changed pitch. The enemy driver noticed a piece of broken wire tangled in the track and instinctively yanked the left tiller toward him. The tank lurched sideways with a roar, tracks tearing up the sod. The hull treacherously moved outside the measured firing sector by a mere 10 feet. The mathematical formula of death developed a fatal crack. The gunner frantically spun the hand wheel, but the barrel thudded dully against the limit of the armored mantlet. The target slipped out of the crosshairs. The traverse was exhausted. Gromov realized the SPG was paralyzed, and in a few seconds, the German gunner would spot the hide and traverse his gun. A short-term leave struck like a blow to the gut, breaking ribs. The journey from the front drained his last reserves. 3 days of continuous jolting in the frozen beds of passing trucks wore his body to the limit. Gromov jumped down to the ground at a familiar intersection. Exactly 300 meters remained along the well-worn track to his home yard. The air suddenly changed density. Instead of the familiar smell of wood smoke, a heavy, acrid stench of burning scorched his nostrils. This smell was etched into his subconscious. This was the smell of destroyed armor. This was the smell of burnt organic matter. Gromov quickened his pace, breaking into a heavy run. The familiar street had turned into a scorched, black corridor. Dozens of houses had been wiped off the face of the earth. Black brick chimneys stood lonely amidst a level layer of gray ash. Gromov burst into his yard. The wooden gate was gone. In place of the fence, charred black stakes protruded crookedly. Instead of a house, a massive, smoking crater yawned. Gray ash covered the ground in a thick layer. The silence hammered against his eardrums harder than a high-explosive blast. The yard was absolutely dead. Gromov took his first step across the ruins. A heavy boot broke a charred board. Glass crunched under his sole. At the edge of a pile of ash lay a small, shapeless object. Gromov dropped to one knee. A rag doll. Half of its dress had smoldered away. The toy's face had melted from the monstrous heat, turning into a shapeless lump. It was his 5-year-old daughter's. The commander's fingers dug into the blackened fabric. The material instantly crumbled into gray dust. His breath stopped. His lungs refused to take in the poisoned air. An unnatural rustle behind him forced him to act on instinct. His body worked, bypassing his consciousness. A sharp pivot, a jerk of the holster, the heavy barrel of the pistol pointing at the source of the sound. A hunched shadow crawled out of a cellar buried in broken brick. Old Petro, the neighbor from across the street. The man looked like a living corpse. Skin stretched over his cheekbones like parchment. The right side of his face was a solid, crimson, weeping burn. His eyes stared into absolute nothingness.
The old man wheezed heavily, every breath coming with physical pain.
"Too late,"
the shell-shocked neighbor's voice cut the air like rusted metal.
2 days too late. Who? The word hit short. Gromov's vocal cords were constricted by an iron band. Tankers, with crosses. The 23rd Panzer Division. They herded the women and children into the big barn. The old man was seized by a terrible, chest-tearing cough. Dark saliva mixed with soot ran down his chin. He clutched Gromov's greatcoat sleeve with trembling fingers. An officer was in command, Major Weber. He was laughing. They stood in a circle, drinking schnapps and guffawing. Then they let loose with a flamethrower, right at the locked doors. No one came out. Yours were in there too. Both of them. The words punched through the armor of his reason. His psyche couldn't handle the overload. Internal fuses blew with a dry snap. The engineer, the loving husband and father, died right there on the dirty snow. Only an empty physical shell remained. A biological mechanism designed for destruction. Gromov silently turned away from his neighbor. He walked to the square foundation of the former barn. He fell to his knees in the hot ash. He threw off his gloves. He began methodically clearing the smoldering debris with his bare hands. Sharp shards of slate and rusted nails bit into his flesh. The skin on his palms split. Dark blood flooded the black coals, instantly searing from the residual heat. Gromov hurled aside charred beams, tore his fingernails, and stripped his skin to the raw meat. The pain was completely blocked by his nervous system. His mind coldly recorded only the volume of the moved mass. 100 weight of ash, 200 kilograms of wood. His back muscles cramped wildly, but his bloodied hands continued to work with the relentless rhythm of a diesel engine's pistons. At a depth of more than 2 feet, his mangled fingers struck something hard. Fragments of charred bone. A fused mass of fabric and ash.
Gromov didn't make a sound. His face turned into a stone mask. Not a single tear appeared in his inflamed eyes. His tear glands had dried up forever. He carefully, with mathematical precision, extracted the blackened remains. He laid them out on a canvas ground sheet. Human compassion vanished. An absolute vacuum formed inside. A machine of vengeance was born. Gromov took a trench tool. He hacked at the frozen earth with fury until the steel blade dulled against the stones. He placed the canvas bundle into the shallow pit. He filled it with frozen clods. He packed down the grave mound with his hobnailed boots. A dead silence hung over the nameless grave. 23rd Panzer Division, Major Weber, Gromov said into the void. His voice sounded dry, devoid of intonation. This wasn't the threat of a grief-stricken man. This was an approved battle plan for total annihilation. A physical law that would inevitably take effect. The fear of his own death burned away to nothing. In its place, an icy, ultra-precise rage crystallized. Gromov rose from his knees. Now, every second of his existence was strictly subordinated to one task. Find them. Burn them to the ground. Erase them into gray dust. The staff dugout greeted him with the stifling, stale smell of cheap tobacco, unwashed bodies, and damp earth. Ivan Gromov silently stepped over the low threshold. A handful of black ash landed with a dull thud on the crudely made wooden table in front of the commander of the heavy self-propelled artillery regiment. The major jerked his sleep-deprived eyes away from the topographic map. Gromov's face resembled a death mask carved from gray granite. His inflamed eyes looked through the man, deathly fixed on only one final goal. The Wehrmacht's 23rd Panzer Division. Gromov's voice sounded extremely dry, without a single human inflection. Major Weber. They burned my family alive.
This column is now my personal target. Belay that insubordination, Captain. The regimental commander cut him off sharply, rising heavily over the table. We have strict orders from the front commander. We hold the defense of the assigned sector. No raids. I'm taking my machine and going for the intercept, with or without orders. Gromov slammed a heavy fist onto the oak tabletop. A red pencil snapped with a dry crack. I know their current route inside out. I know how they think. The air in the cramped bunker compressed to the limit. Rigid military subordination broke against the granite, primal rage of the engineer. The regimental commander looked into the absolutely dead eyes of his best subordinate and saw an icy readiness to immediately bypass a court-martial and a firing squad. The major slowly, heavily sat back down on the wooden stool. He silently pulled a thin stack of radiograms toward him. The partisans gave a precise fix exactly 1 hour ago, the regimental commander said, not looking up at Gromov. Square 73. They're moving toward the pontoon crossing. You have exactly 24 hours. Order received. The harsh Soviet school of tank building had originally created these impenetrable steel monsters for exactly such merciless death marches. 46 tons of heavy Ural steel tore away with a deafening roar. The driver slammed the stiff main clutch pedal all the way down. The 12-cylinder diesel engine roared, strained, belching a thick column of black, sooty smoke into the gray sky. The heavy SPG began an unprecedented, grueling dash through the impassable, rotten Polesian marshes. This was no longer a tactical flanking maneuver. This was pure physical violence against complex machinery and the fragile human body. Wide tracks ruthlessly tore through the viscous black peat. The massive machine tilted threateningly, its steel road wheels scooping up foul-smelling swamp muck with a wet squelch. Gromov stood in the open commander's hatch, correcting the course with harsh, clipped phrases. The heavy tracks slipped and screeched over sunken, rotten tree trunks. The transmission wailed continuously at the very limit of the metal's strength. The engine oil temperature climbed rapidly toward the critical red line. Inside the cramped, armored compartment, it was pure hell. The weak fans were completely unable to handle the thick flow of exhaust gases. The air was heavily saturated with toxic diesel fumes, gunpowder soot, and the smell of scorched rubber. A sudden failure struck his nerves. The right track lost traction on the solid ground and began to spin wildly in the bottomless quagmire. The machine started to roll onto its right side. "Temperature's at 110! The engine's gonna blow!" The driver yelled over the deafening roar of the diesel, choking on a dry cough. "Keep the revs up! Don't drop the throttle!" Gromov screamed into the buzzing intercom. The driver suddenly lost consciousness from severe oxygen deprivation and the unbearable heat. His head fell limply right onto the steel tillers. The heavy SPG lurched sharply to the left, ready to bog down forever, up to its roof in the deadly mire. Gromov instantly dove into the smoke-filled compartment. He roughly shoved the driver's limp body aside and gripped the red-hot steel tillers himself. The engineer physically felt every strained stroke of the dying diesel. He played the massive RPMs with surgical precision, pulling the multi-ton mass out of the deadly mud trap onto solid ground by his nerves alone. His back muscles cramped wildly from the monstrous resistance of the stiff clutches. The machine roared, its entire hull trembling convulsively, but it crawled forward relentlessly, breaking out onto the dry, open ground. The frantic pursuit ground on deep into the night. The machine tracked the cooling ruts of the enemy's treads with surgical precision. Gromov pushed the SPG to a breakneck speed, forcing the engine far beyond its design limits. Fuel consumption, already critical, blew past every standing regulation. The thick metal of the hull was hot to the touch. The exhausted crew operated on pure reflex, passing around a dented canteen of warm water that tasted of motor oil. Every kilometer of this hellish march took months off their lives. They were hot on the heels of brutal executioners, closing the distance with the ruthless methodicalness of a clockwork mechanism. The steel trap snapped shut as a misty dawn broke. The night's radio intercepts were finally confirmed by direct visual contact. A massive German armored armada crawled heavily into a deep forest hollow and cut their engines in unison. The enemy settled in for a long morning halt. Hundreds of weary soldiers leaped off the dusty armor with relief. They felt absolutely safe, deep within their own operational rear. Gromov's heavy SPG crawled into a thick tree line on the commanding heights, silent as the grave, at minimum idle. The grueling, meticulous work of concealment began. 46 tons of angular metal had to melt into the forest landscape. The crew worked in absolute silence, tearing their palms bloody on stiff oak branches. Every protruding detail of the casemate and every road wheel was carefully hidden under a thick layer of fresh boughs. The long howitzer barrel was wrapped tight in a filthy camo net. Gromov himself, crawling on his belly, checked every inch from the enemy's perspective. The giant killing machine blended perfectly into the woods. The wide muzzle brake was trained directly on the crossroads in the hollow. The barrel stared into the dense cluster of enemy armor. The gun was loaded. The wait for inevitable death began. The optical lens of the panoramic sight ruthlessly compressed the space. Through the thick armored glass, Ivan Gromov methodically scanned the floor of the deep forest hollow. The air above the dusty dirt road shimmers with the monstrous heat of dozens of cooling engines. The heavy Soviet SPG sat frozen on the steep slope, dead still, fused into the forest.
The commander's fingers rotated the fine-tuning hand wheel millimeter by millimeter. The black crosshairs glided smoothly over the gray armored hulls of the enemy machines. Suddenly, the sight jerked to a stop. Gromov stopped breathing. Near the lead command vehicle stood a man in an unbuttoned black tunic. The high-quality German optics brought the arrogant face ruthlessly close. Reddish hair, deep, harsh shadows under cold eyes, the dull glint of an iron cross at his neck. Major Weber, the butcher. The very officer who had cold-bloodedly ordered hundreds of women and children burned alive in a locked barn. Gromov's index finger instinctively rested on the cold metal of the trigger. A primal, physiological urge demanded he squeeze it immediately. One light click would instantly send heavy death straight into the murderer's chest. But cold engineering and tactical calculation overrode his human rage. With a massive effort of will, Gromov pulled his trembling finger away. A single shot would kill the major, but would immediately scatter the entire division. The enemy infantry would take cover, the tanks would disperse into the woods, and a single, lumbering suicide machine would be inevitably destroyed by flanking fire. The mission wasn't about petty personal revenge. The combat objective demanded the total annihilation of the entire mechanized column. The enemy had to pack their ranks as tightly as possible. The commander forced himself to endure, turning his hatred into cold tactical calculation. The hollow below breathed with deceptive calm. The German armored armada finally relaxed during the long halt. The elite division felt absolutely safe, deep within their own operational rear. Soldiers stripped off their sweat-soaked, dusty tunics in droves, exposing dirty white backs to the scorching sun. They laughed loudly, leaning lazily against the warm road wheels of their heavy tanks. Aluminum mess tins clattered. The enemies greedily gorged on heated canned meat, passing around metal canteens of strong schnapps. The distance closed to a critical minimum. Through the tightly sealed hatches of the heavy SPG, snatches of guttural speech drifted in on gusts of wind. This monstrous carelessness rapidly turned the enemy into a perfect group target. The vehicles huddled into one tight mass, completely blocking any possible paths for maneuver. Inside the battened-down armored casemate, the temperature soared past the limits of human endurance. The July sun mercilessly baked 46 tons of Ural steel. The enclosed space turned into a literal blast furnace. The oxygen was almost entirely burned away. There was physically nothing to breathe. Thick, acrid sweat flooded their eyes, stinging corneas inflamed by insomnia, flowing in sticky streams down the collars of heavy canvas coveralls. The crew merged with the machine's red-hot metal. 5 living men voluntarily surrendered the right to the slightest movement. Any careless clatter of a hobnailed boot against the ribbed steel floor would echo through the hull and give away the ambush. The men became silent, static appendages of the artillery system. The massive steel breech of the 152mm gun took up half of the cramped fighting compartment. The loader leaned his damp chest against the breech, trying to steady his racing heart. His forearms were covered in fresh purple bruises and deep abrasions from the hellish labor of handling heavy munitions. 40 kilograms of steel are already in the tube. Breech is closed. The loader's dry whisper, saturated with poisonous hatred, scraped against the dead silence of the casemate. Waiting on your word.
Let's tear them to fucking shreds, Commander.
His lower back burned with unbearable fire. His muscles were seized by a brutal cramp from the constant strain, but his bloodied fingers, black with powder soot, were already locked onto the next heavy HE frag shell in the rack. He was ready to ram it into the hot barrel the second the first recoil occurred. The psychological pressure inside the stationary machine reached a breaking point. The stale air literally rang, stretching like a guitar string a moment before the snap. Every extra second of this agonizing wait multiplied the risk of failure. Gromov stared unblinkingly into the eyepiece. The engineering plan was working with terrifying perfection. Officers from across the column gathered at Weber's command tank to discuss the route. A massive fuel tanker, filled to the brim, parked heavily next to them. The enemy armor lined up flank to flank. The tanker carried tons of high-octane gasoline. A direct HE hit on that thin-walled tank would instantly create a volumetric explosion of colossal power. The burning liquid would flood the engine compartments of neighboring vehicles, forcing a chain reaction. Gromov shifted the crosshairs from the hated Major's chest to the bulging side of the fuel tanker. Personal revenge took a back seat to pure destructive efficiency. The fire had to burn them all. Gromov slowly drew the scorching air, smelling of motor oil and sweat, into his burning lungs. His finger rested on the firing lever again. His muscles tensed, ready to overcome the metal's resistance. Exactly one dull heartbeat remained before the order. The tension was stretched to the absolute limit, ready to snap with a deafening crack. But suddenly, a bright ray of the midday sun broke through the thick foliage of an ancient oak. A sudden twist of fate broke the perfect physics of the ambush. The movement of the sun changed the angle of the rays, and a single rogue sunbeam pierced the dense canopy.
The light struck unerringly into the open lens of the panoramic sight. The multi-layered glass acted as a perfect optical mirror. A sharp, blindingly white glint shot out from under the dusty camo net. The flash landed directly in the shaded hollow. A German sentry by the outermost half-track froze mid-step. The flash cut right across his eyes. Instinct took over instantly. The soldier dropped his metal canteen, water splashing into the dry dust. The enemy screamed, frantically ripping a heavy submachine gun from his shoulder. The weapon jerked in his sweaty hands. A long burst of lead blindly stitched the tree line. Thick branches, sheared off by bullets, fell onto the front armor of the Soviet SPG. The concealment was blown. The silence died with the dry snap of splintering wood. The illusion of safety dissolved in the acrid smoke of the first shots. The entire enemy column flinched like a single living organism. The laughter cut off instantly. With guttural roars, the soldiers dropped their mess tins, knocked over ammo crates, and grabbed their carbines. The gray mass of infantry scattered behind the steel tracks of the tanks. With a roar, the enemy began a rapid tactical movement up the steep slope, straight toward the source of the glint. In the stifling casemate, the heavy radio crackled to life. The speaker spewed a burst of static and the panic-stricken voice of the HQ radio man. The airwaves were flooded with an urgent directive. Battalion observers had spotted the exposure of the firing position. The HQ order was categorical. Immediate withdrawal, position compromised, deploy smoke screens and retreat to the secondary defensive line. Gromov ripped the sweat-soaked tanker helmet off his head. The thick rubber cord stretched taut and tore out of the jack with a dry snap. The commander cut the communication channel with the outside world. Military subordination was gone. His hand, in a filthy canvas glove, landed on the heavy handle of the commander's hatch. A sharp jerk downward, and the thick steel plate broke free from the latch. A deafening metallic bang sealed the 5 tankers inside the scorching space. The locks clanged shut, cutting off any path for retreat.
"Commander, direct order to withdraw. We're burned! Infantry is flanking from the left!" the driver screamed, his voice cracking. His hands frantically hammered the stiff steering levers. "Engaging the starter! Backing out!" "Don't you move this machine! Keep the RPMs at 0, Gromov barked. His voice cut through the rising clatter of enemy weapons outside. "Hold your ground!" "They'll burn us alive with Panzerfaust at point-blank range! The distance is closing!" The loader pressed his wet back into the iron ammo rack. "The gun is laid on the primary target. The retreat is cancelled. Do your jobs!" The commander's cold tone instantly paralyzed the crew's panic. Gromov became an immovable obstacle. The driver slammed his fists against the levers but pulled his feet off the pedals. The engine remained silent. The gap between the edge of the commander's hatch and the roof of the casemate was only a few millimeters. An incompletely tightened stopper left a tiny crack. A stray bullet from a German submachine gun found this mathematical vulnerability. The lead struck the bevel of the hardened armor plate at high speed. The bullet deformed from the horrific impact, losing its jacket but retaining colossal kinetic energy. A jagged piece of white-hot metal whistled into the fighting compartment. The hot fragment pierced the thick fabric of the commander's tunic with a wet crunch. The lead sank deep into Gromov's left shoulder, shattering the bone. The kinetic shock knocked him off his feet. His back slammed into the massive steel breech of the howitzer with a dull thud. Dark, thick blood instantly soaked his uniform, dripping loudly onto the ribbed iron floor. Shock threatened to pull him into darkness.
Gromov blocked the pain through sheer force of will. Adrenaline burned away physical weakness. He pushed off the breech, wheezing through gritted teeth. The commander took a hard step forward, ignoring his left arm hanging like a dead weight. His healthy right hand clenched into a stone fist. He drew back and punched the armored steel above the gunner's head with all his might. "Fire!" Gromov's animal roar shredded the crew's eardrums, drowning out the noise of the attacking infantry. The overstretched silence exploded. With a shout, the loader lunged away from the gun. The gunner slammed his full weight onto the foot pedal. The heavy steel firing pin struck the copper primer with a clang. The massive powder charge detonated instantly. The colossal overpressure shoved the shell out of the long rifled barrel with monstrous force. 46 tons of armor shuddered from the recoil. The multi-ton barrel made a sharp, crushing backward stroke, dousing the casemate in heat. The driver mashed the starter button. The 12-cylinder diesel engine flared to life with a deafening roar, belching a thick cloud of black smoke. The point of no return had been passed. The 152-millimeter strike ripped through the summer air with a deafening crack. The recoil drove the SPG's wide tracks deep into the forest soil. The 40-kilogram shell covered the distance in fractions of a second. The engineer's mathematical calculation worked with absolute precision. The lethal slug howled as it slammed into the bulging side of the fuel tanker at the center of the enemy cluster. The contact fuse initiated detonation. The thin steel of the tank burst like a drum. Tons of high-octane gasoline transitioned into a fine aerosol and ignited from the primary blast. In a single second, the forest hollow turned into a roaring cauldron of 2,000-degree flame. A volumetric explosion generated a shock wave that snapped the thick trunks of ancient trees along the ravine. The firestorm greedily burned away the oxygen, creating a lethal vacuum. The flames instantly engulfed the command tanks. The chain reaction kicked off without delay. Overheated hull armor burst along the weld seams. The detonating ammunition inside the lead German vehicle ripped off the multi-ton turret with a dull roar. The massive steel structure flew a dozen meters into the air, spinning in thick black smoke, and crashed onto the roof of a neighboring half-track with a crushing clang. The heavy metal instantly mashed the vehicle into a flat pancake. Inside the white-hot casemate of the Soviet SPG, a frantic, rhythmic carousel of hell began. The loader worked far beyond the limits of human capability. "Frag! Load it!" Gromov wheezed, clamping his hand over the bleeding wound on his shattered shoulder. "Up!" the loader roared, ramming the shell into the breech. "Right 005! On the infantry cluster! Fire!" The loader's knuckles were beaten into a bloody pulp against the metal. His back muscles were seized by a paralyzing cramp, but the rhythm of destruction didn't break. Another crushing shot made the 46 tons of steel shudder. The extraction mechanism spit the smoking, red-hot brass casing onto the floor with a ring. The last remnants of oxygen burned away. The crew greedily inhaled acrid powder smoke, their lungs tearing with dry coughs. The loader blindly grabbed the next shell. The rate of fire reached unthinkable levels. The shockwave from every shot hammered the tanker's eardrums, causing blood to leak from their noses and ears. The monstrous, destructive power of the Beast Slayer firing over open sights left the enemy no chance. The fragments acted like a relentless industrial shredder. Upon detonation, the cast-iron body of the massive shell disintegrated into thousands of razor-sharp fragments, flying at supersonic speeds. They punched through the thin armor of the German half-tracks like wet cardboard and tore through the steel track links of the medium tanks, deadlocking them. The German infantry literally evaporated in the epicenters of the explosions. The forest hollow was filled with piercing shrieks of terror. Men burning alive scrambled in blind panic between the blazing husks of armored vehicles. Another aimed 152mm blast ended their misery, turning biological bodies into a fine, bloody mist. Burning diesel flowed in wide rivers across the floor of the ravine, leaving the infantry no safe ground. "Armor piercing! On the one breaking for the slope!" The commander's voice clanged like cold metal through the roar. "On the way!" The gunner slammed the pedal with all his weight. The heavy, armor-piercing slug ripped through the engine compartment of the tank, trying to escape. The enemy engine flared with a blinding white light. The fire sack was cinched tight. There was no longer an exit from the death hollow. The paths of retreat were blocked by the blazing, mangled husks of the lead and rear vehicles. At the edge of this man-made hell, the absolute collapse of the enemy command took place. A concussed Major Weber, having miraculously escaped a direct hit in the first seconds of the slaughter, fell to his knees in the viscous mud of blood and hot ash. His uniform was torn to shreds. His face was caked in greasy black soot. The butcher, who once cold-bloodedly ordered defenseless people burned alive, was now sobbing hysterically, gasping for air. With eyes wide and maddened by animal terror, he watched as his invincible elite division burned alive under a continuous storm of aimed fire. 230 highly trained soldiers vanish into the roaring flames without a trace. No complex tactics, no soldierly heroism, just the blind, relentless physics of a shaped charge explosion. Gromov feels not the slightest hint of triumph or long-awaited relief. Methodically, like a clockwork mechanism stripped of all human emotion, he continues to bark the coordinates for new targets. Thick blood pulses from his mangled shoulder, drenching the ribbed steel floor. Center! Fire! The heavy breech clacks shut with a dry, metallic snap.
Another massive shockwave rattles the searing air. The heavy machine methodically, shot after shot, grinds the doomed column into motionless, smoking slag. The heavy steel wedge of the breech blocks open, spitting the last smoking shell casing onto the iron floor with a dull ring. The extraction mechanism strikes hot metal in vain. The massive combat load is completely spent. A deafening, unnatural silence instantly drops over the scorched forest hollow, pressing against eardrums heavier than the weight of the atmosphere. The crew is seized by agonizing cramps from the sudden drop in acoustic pressure. The roar of the 12-cylinder diesel sputters, misses its beats, and finally dies. The 46-ton machine grinds to a halt on the slope, venting thick blue steam from its overheated radiators. Below, the Panzer Division is gone. At the bottom of the deep ravine, a colossal, scorched wasteland smolders. Searing metal cools with a sinister, dry crackle. Thick, acrid black smoke from the burning rubber of the road wheels blankets the mangled earth like a heavy shroud. The air hums with residual thermal radiation, warping the perspective. Instead of a formidable mechanized armada, only mountains of shapeless, twisted iron, deep puddles of molten aluminum, and tons of smoking ash remain in the hollow. The war here ended in the absolute physical destruction of matter. The fire consumed organic life without leaving a trace. The wide tracks of the German machines are fused forever into the vitrified, scorched soil. Overheated torsion bars snap, letting out long, dull groans of breaking steel. The ground is covered in a thick layer of greasy black soot. No triumph.
Only the cold, mechanical confirmation of the enemy's total annihilation. Out of 230 professional executioners, only 3 physically survive. Basic biological instincts for self-preservation force these charred bodies to stir weakly. They slowly crawl out from under the collapsed frontal armor of a burned-out APC. These Wehrmacht soldiers have lost their human form forever. Their eardrums burst from the monstrous pressure drops caused by the volumetric explosions of super-heavy, high-explosive shells. Shell-shocked, robbed of hearing and reason, the invaders crawl on all fours through the searing ash. They whine softly, like animals, in unbearable terror, leaving wet, bloody furrows in the soot. Their faces are covered in a hard crust of soot and clotted blood. The elite infantry is psychologically broken and physically destroyed. They blindly poke at red-hot pieces of armor plating with charred hands, burning flesh to the bone, yet feeling no pain. Their central nervous systems have been scorched by extreme shock. Their minds remain forever trapped in this closed fire trap, ruthlessly crushed by the kinetic power of Soviet artillery. 2 hours later, a Soviet forward reconnaissance team stealthily reaches the high ground. The scouts freeze in silence at the edge of the ravine. These seasoned soldiers go numb at the scale of the man-made carnage. They see the camouflaged, self-propelled gun, its heavy tracks frozen into the steep slope. The long barrel of the gun has turned black, thick with scale from critical overheating. The heavy camouflage netting has completely disintegrated from the muzzle blast. The scouts cautiously climb onto the machine's frontal armor. The metal sears their palms even through thick fabric. The team leader hammers with all his might using the heavy steel butt of his submachine gun against the jammed commander's hatch. The steel locks give way with a heavy, ear-piercing screech. The massive lid swings back. From the dark interior of the armored casemate, a concentrated stench of burnt powder, scorched insulation, and thick human blood hits them in the face. Darkness reigns inside the cramped fighting compartment. The crew lies on the floor in a deep faint from severe hypoxia and shell shock. With great effort, the soldiers pull out the limp body of Ivan Gromov. The engineer is bleeding out. His canvas uniform is soaked through with a sticky red substance. His left shoulder is a shattered mess of bone fragments and torn muscle. The pulse at his carotid artery is barely detectable, but his shock-stricken brain flatly refuses to stop the destruction algorithm. The commander's pale lips move incessantly and monotonically. He continues to hoarsely whisper precise mathematical coordinates and commands to the gunner into the ringing forest void, forever stuck in the seconds of the firefight. The physical destruction of the mechanized column triggers a destructive chain reaction far behind the front lines. A shockwave of icy panic strikes directly at the staff offices in Berlin. Radio intercepts of the fragmented and hysterical reports from the dying major land on the desks of the Wehrmacht High Command. The dry lines of typewritten German documents dispassionately state an unbelievable fact. A full-strength tank division has been completely wiped off the face of the earth in just a few dozen minutes of combat. No massive air raid, no large-scale artillery preparation. Only one camouflaged heavy machine and a precisely engineered ambush. The enemy's general staff analysts fall into a stupor. In protected offices, a primal, animal fear of the Soviet school of tank building is born. Fear of the lumbering steel monster, capable of methodically grinding elite units into gray dust. The rigid ruthlessness of Ural armor steel breaks the German strategic plan. Retribution has been served, leaving behind only mountains of cooling ash. The sharp smell of carbolic acid and clotted blood hits his nostrils. The white hospital ceiling swims before his eyes. Ivan Gromov slowly regains consciousness. His left shoulder is tightly bound in a heavy dressing. Pulsating pain stabs through his body with every uneven breath. The heavy door creaks. A general enters the cramped ward, his boots clicking in a measured stride. A gold star glints dully on his dress tunic. The High Command has arrived in person to decorate the commander for the unprecedented destruction of an entire tank column. The general holds out an open velvet box containing the state's highest award. Gromov slowly turns his head. His eyes are absolutely dead. It is the gaze of a man looking through living matter. The engineer's right hand, covered in fresh crimson burns, rises heavily from the sheet. A hard, short strike to the general's wrist. The velvet box flies aside. The gold award hits the dirty wooden floor with a dull, metallic ring. The general freezes. A heavy, suffocating silence hangs in the ward. The refusal of the award breaks the military's coordinate system. The general leaves without a word. A minute later, a man in a wool tunic without rank insignia enters the ward. A security officer from the Osobist department. The officer dryly snaps the metal locks of a thick cardboard folder. He pulls a hard stool close to the iron cot. A ruthless, protocol-driven interrogation begins. You abandoned a strategic defensive line without authorization. You ignored a direct order to retreat. You put state equipment at risk of destruction. The officer's voice cuts through the air like an icy razor. What were your true motives? Gromov sits up with a sharp jerk. The fresh surgical stitches on his shoulder pop with a dry snap. Dark blood immediately seeps through the thick layer of white bandages, soaking his hospital shirt. He ignores the pain completely. The engineer's face turns into a frozen stone mask. I wasn't fulfilling a combat mission. I wasn't defending a line. Gromov's voice sounds monotonic,
devoid of any emotional color. I deliberately hunted down the 23rd Panzer Division. I committed the planned mass murder of 230 men. They burned my wife and daughter alive. This was my own personal execution. I burned them to the ground. Now, put me against the wall. Court-martial and firing squad. The scratching of the pen suddenly stops. The rigid machine of military justice slams into the absolute, impenetrable void of a scorched human soul. The officer raises a heavy gaze to the tanker. He doesn't see a criminal or a deserter. He sees a perfect, irreversibly broken killing machine. The instinct for self-preservation in this organism has been physically destroyed. The front command critically needs a large-scale heroic myth about the unyielding resilience of Soviet crews. A public tribunal for a vigilante would immediately shatter the propaganda legend. The system makes a pragmatic decision. The incident is instantly suppressed. The folder is snapped shut. A top-secret stamp is slammed onto the report. 3 weeks later, the hospital gates open with a heavy clang. Gromov steps out into the icy autumn rain. The physical shell has been restored. The torn muscles have knitted into ugly, skin-tightening scars. But the man inside has died for good. Not even a shadow remains of the gifted Kharkov designer. The street greets him with gray indifference. Inside his chest, only a ringing, absolute vacuum pulses. The fear of death has completely atrophied. There is no more physical pain, no more human pity. The biological mechanism has switched to autonomous mode. The command dryly returns Gromov to the ranks. They hand him a new, heavy, self-propelled gun. 46 tons of fresh Ural armor steel. The new crew looks at their commander with undisguised, primal, animal terror. The young tankers physically feel the grave-like cold radiating from him. Gromov does not speak to people. He communicates only in dry, clipped mathematical coordinates. The slightest mistake by the loader draws not a shout, but an icy stare that makes the blood run cold. The driver is terrified to drop the RPMs even under heavy enemy artillery fire. The crew works at the edge of nervous exhaustion, rigidly obeying the silent will of their commander. The heavy machine moves out. A long, mechanical, merciless death march begins. Gromov's SPG turns into a ruthless ghost of the battlefield. The machine methodically, meter by meter, crushes enemy trenches with its heavy, wide tracks. The 152mm shells indifferently grind reinforced concrete bunkers into gray dust. Gromov feels not the slightest joy from the large-scale destruction of the enemy. He does not leave the cramped casemate for weeks. The acrid smell of powder smoke and burnt diesel fuel has replaced clean oxygen for him forever. Months blur into one continuous, monotonous, bloody streak. Western Ukraine gives way to Poland. Heavy tracks tear up the asphalt of European roads. The steel avalanche rolls westward without stopping, sweeping away any attempts at organized resistance. Gromov calculates the vulnerabilities in the enemy's defense with mathematical precision. He cold-bloodedly directs the multi-ton mass of metal straight into the center of the heaviest fire contact. Armor-piercing rounds tear through the thick plating of German heavy tanks, turning the crews trapped inside into charred remains. Spring 1945. The burning ruins of Berlin. The capital of the enemy state crumbles under the continuous, crushing blows of Soviet heavy artillery. The air is thick with acrid brick dust and the heavy stench of a massive urban fire. Gromov's SPG idles at a crossroads on a ruined street. The 12-cylinder engine labors at low idle. Through the narrow slit of the optical triplex, the commander silently watches the columns of surrendering German soldiers trudging past.
The enemy has been physically destroyed. Retribution has been achieved on an absolute, total scale. The enemy's military state machine has been crushed by steel tracks. But inside Gromov, nothing changes. The ash of a family burned alive cannot be compensated for by millions of enemy corpses. The mathematical equation of revenge has no solution. Brutal physical slaughter did not bring a single murdered child back to life. The war is ending, but the void in his scorched soul only grows larger and unbearably darker. Gromov pulls the lever and kills the overheated diesel engine. In the ensuing dead silence, he hears only the dull, monotonous thumping of his own empty heart. The global meat grinder of 1945 brings its blood-stained steel gears to a halt with a dull grind. The total war is officially over. Enormous armies are demobilized. Ivan Gromov silently turns in his state property, strips off the heavy canvas uniform reeking of machine oil and embedded gunpowder, and vanishes forever into the bustle of civilian life. The former brilliant designer of heavy tanks voluntarily refuses any high positions, privileges, or career prospects. He takes a job as an ordinary design engineer at a common plant manufacturing bridge structures. Gromov ruthlessly severs every single military connection. He burns rare letters from former comrades unopened, never appears at veteran reunions, and locks away his scorched past as if behind a multi-ton armor plate. His high state awards tarnish and rust at the bottom of an old, dusty toolbox. The former tanker silently builds faceless gray piers, obsessively, to the point of a nervous tick, verifying every millimeter in the dull blueprints of civilian spans. The military state machine operates with pragmatic, icy calculation. The perfectly calibrated tactics of his suicidal ambushes, the mathematical algorithm for the total fire destruction of superior enemy forces, are deemed too cruel and unpredictable for mass military application. The ruined country urgently needs bright, flawless stories of mass heroism, self-sacrifice, and brotherhood. The story of a blind, calculating lone vigilante who turned 46 tons of Ural armor into a personal instrument of mass execution crudely shatters the proper ideological construct. The thick cardboard folder containing the detailed analysis of the destruction of the Wehrmacht's 23rd Panzer Division is immediately stamped with a strict, top-secret classification. Archivists hide the documents on the deepest shelves of the Ministry of Defense's closed underground vaults. The mathematics of death is buried for decades. The documented fact of the mass physical elimination of hundreds of people is erased from official public history, turning into a non-existent tactical phantom. Long, heavy decades pass. On the surface, peaceful life flows in its ordinary course. Gromov starts a new family, silently raises children, and mechanically rocks his grandson in his arms. Those around him see only a withdrawn, stern old man with deep, ugly scars on his left shoulder. No one knows that inside this aging biological shell, the jammed clockwork mechanism is still running. The psychological trauma does not fade with time. It only becomes covered in a thick, hard crust of hollow cynicism. Every night, the former commander of the heavy SPG wakes up in a cold, sticky sweat from the non-existent smell of burning diesel and scorched human flesh. The ash of his first family, burned alive, has fused forever in his shattered consciousness with the greasy black ash of 230 incinerated German soldiers.
This acrid, invisible slag clogs his airways, physically preventing him from breathing the steady air of peace. Retribution proved to be a hollow mathematical formula with no retroactive power. Killing the executioners did not undo the brutal fact of his family's death. The human body's biological resources are finally exhausted. The terminal stage arrives. On his deathbed, the heavy steel armor of decades of silence develops a fatal, irreparable crack. His worn-out heart pumps thick blood through narrowed vessels with colossal effort. Gromov's withered fingers, covered in age spots, desperately clutch the warm hand of his grown grandson. The dying engineer's eyes glitter feverishly in the dim light of the stifling bedroom. The monstrous psychological burden, suppressed for decades, breaks out in a ragged, heavy whisper. "I am no hero." The old man's voice breaks into a dry, barking cough that ruthlessly tears at his withered chest. "I am just a machine. A common, soulless engineering press that methodically crushed a crowd of living people." The grandson fearlessly tries to adjust the slipping blanket, but the old man rigidly blocks his movement with the remnants of his physical strength. "Listen to me carefully. They gave me 46 tons of heavy iron. I hunted every last one of them down. I cold-bloodedly trapped them in a forest hollow. I ordered the heavy, high-explosive shells to be fired directly into the thin fuel tanks filled with high-octane gas." The old man's breathing falters critically, turning into a heavy, wet, rattling gasp. "They burned alive. Hundreds of people shattered from the monstrous heat like cheap glass vials. I stared into the optical sight without blinking and felt absolutely nothing inside. No human pity, no long-awaited relief. I naively thought that someone else's fire would burn away my own pain forever. But it just burned me out from the inside to the very foundation. The acrid ash of those killed Germans didn't give me a single day of peace. I physically destroyed them, but my wife and my little daughter remained there forever, in that cold, gray ash. I simply multiplied the number of corpses in this world, for no reason. My blind revenge fixed nothing. It became my own personal, unbearable cross. I carried this massive, dead graveyard inside me for half a century." The heart monitor emits a steady, monotonous, continuous beep. The biological mechanism finally stops. The heavy story of a feat performed in the name of boundless love for a family, a love that transformed into absolute, destructive physical rage, ends with a quiet death in a sterile hospital room. The feat becomes a curse for one strong man. Exactly half a century after the end of the global conflict, an anonymous archivist in a dusty state vault methodically removes the rusted metal staples from a yellowed cardboard folder. The declassified historical document is placed on the cold glass of a scanner. The dry, typewritten text dispassionately reads, "Combat Engagement Report, Operation Fire Ambush. Effectiveness of engagement against enemy personnel concentration, 100%. The precise engineering summary of destroyed human lives remains forever the only material evidence of this soul-chilling tragedy."